Hello, this is Paul. I'm the creator of PoserPhysics 2012, and this is a tutorial on the ragdoll physics within PoserPhysics. I'm going to cover 4 basic items, the first one being the different ragdoll modes. Secondly, we'll look at some of the global parameters that can impact the ragdoll physics. Thirdly, we'll look at joint limits. And fourthly, we'll look at the parameter dials associated with ragdolls. First, let's have a look at the different modes, the different ragdoll modes. So if we load up, this is Casual Ryan, you'll see that by default he is movable, and when we run that simulation he'll just collapse as a normal ragdoll would. You see, fall to the floor here. Now, one thing you'll notice about the ragdoll physics is the hands do not move. So you can see his thumb and fingers are all static throughout the whole animation. So it's probably worth actually putting the hands in a more natural pose. I'm not sure if Ryan, we can sort of grasp. I'll just set his grasp there. So it's a bit more natural. So then when you run it, his hands aren't looking all stiff. So that is the movable mode. You can, if you untick the include in simulation, that will mean that Ryan will not be part of the simulation at all, so other objects will not collide with him. I'll retick that. If we make him immovable, then when you run the simulation he won't move, but other objects would bounce off Ryan. So if we put a sphere or a cube falling, they would actually bounce off him. I'll just cancel that. There is also a keyframed mode, and the keyframe means that he will follow any keyframes in the animation system and ignore the physics of the scene. So when he's keyframed, if you've got him keyframe walking, he'll just walk through the scene, but other objects will bounce off him. If he's movable keyframed until hit, he will follow his keyframed animation until he hits any other physics object. So if you have used the walk animation, the poser walk system, and he walks into a wall, he will be keyframed until he hits the wall, and then when he hits the wall he will drop down using the normal ragdoll physics. And there is a fifth option which is locked, and I'll explain that in a minute. To best explain how these work, if we load in a physics force, this is the new force prop with service release 1, and we will apply the force to Casual Ryan by parenting the force prop to his waist, and that means it will apply the force to his waist. And then under the parameters of the force prop we can say apply a force of say 200 units at frame 5 of the simulation, and we will turn the force around a little. Let's make it so it'll apply a rightward force to his waist. So looking at a few of the different scenarios, if we select Ryan, if he's immovable, when we run the simulation, the simulation will actually terminate because you cannot apply a force to an immovable object. So we're running the simulation at the moment, and you'll see that it gives an error. If we make Ryan movable, he will start collapsing, and then at frame 5 be pushed off to the right. So he's collapsing and then gets pushed off to the right at frame 5. If we make him keyframed nothing will happen because the force will only be applied to an ODE controlled object. If we make Ryan movable keyframed until hit, he will be keyframed until the force hits him at frame 5. So now at the moment Ryan has got a dropping animation in the poser keyframes, so we want to clear that before we run the script. So I'll go into the PoserPhysics extras and clear all the keyframes. So now he should stand up with that and not move, and then when the force hits him at frame 5, he will then be physics controlled. So there we are. So that works quite nicely. Now the other option, the fifth item I mentioned before, was locked, and that is where the ragdoll is created but the joints are frozen. So the ragdoll as a whole will move, but the limbs will not bend. So if we can put him in locked, and you can see we can sort of move an arm a bit and move his head. So he will be locked in this stance. Now when we run this in the lock state, he will gradually topple over because he's not very good at balancing in the lock mode. So we're running it, and then he gets pushed. So it gives a demonstration of how that's running. I'll just so they're the Ragdoll keyframe modes. If we look at some of the simulation settings, I'll just change that to movable and delete the prop. Let's now look at the second component, which is some of the global parameters, and there's two that affect the Ragdoll physics. One is the joint hardness. So joint hardness of 0 or 0.1 or 0.2 means that the joins between the ragdoll limbs are very loose. So it means that he kind of, I'll just zero that figure to better articulate it. It means that when he bends his arm in the ragdoll, the joint may come apart a bit. Now you won't notice that, but the reason you can go with very loose settings is because it means the ragdoll will be more flexible throughout the scene. So if you've got very hard settings, ODE, the physics engine, will, if it cannot resolve a constraint or a joint, so for example if an arm is inside a sphere, then the ragdoll will explode and the simulation becomes unstable. So for example, if you apply a very big force to Ryan's waist, the ragdoll will explode if you've got a hard joint settings. If you've got soft joint settings, you won't. So that's the joint settings. Now in ODE terms, that's called the ERP, the error reduction parameter. And then there's a second parameter, which is this in ODE language called CFM, which is the constraint force matching. And you can look these up on the web. But in general, if you have very low joint hardness, you want to have a very high stiffness, say 0.1. And if you have very hard joints, say 0.9, you might have very, very low joint stiffness. That's sort of the way it works. As one goes up, the other one comes down. There's also a checkbox here for whether or not the ragdolls in the scene are humanoid or not. So if you tick this, and that's the default, it means that the ragdoll is human, and it will apply some generalist joint limits that are more human-like to get a better simulation. If you've got dogs and cats and horses, then untick this factor here. The other one is gravity. You might actually find that the ragdoll simulations look better. So if we run this simulation with high gravity, he sort of collapses to the ground. If you change the gravity to be very low, say minus 0.2, then he doesn't actually fall as quickly. It takes a lot longer. So you can actually get more realistic ragdoll simulations with a lower gravity factor there. He didn't fall within 30 frames there. Okay, let's have a look at some of the joint limit settings. I'll just turn this around and lift him up a little. So if we look at Ryan's thigh and we turn limits on, then we can bend his thigh plus 60. He's got a range of minus 120 degrees through to 60. So when the ragdoll is built, it sets the maximum bend between the bone in his thigh to his waist to be equal to the joint limits in the figure. Now you might find that the joint limits are too high and they give a very floppy simulation, and they don't accurately simulate what needs to be happening. So if we look under the body actor of Casual Ryan, you can see there is a joint limit %, and that's set to 0.7, which is 70%. So that means whatever the poser joint limit % is, the PoserPhysics Ragdoll will only take 70% of that range of movement. So if we run this simulation, we should find that when he first runs, his leg will, you can see that it popped back to the outer limit for that joint. So in general, you will get better results by constraining the joint limit %. So even 0.5 might give you a better simulation result of the ragdoll. You can fine tune it. So a 0.5 joint limit % means that the range of movement of every limb will be half what the poser joint limit is for that limb. So you can see the sidestep. You know, Ryan can do the splits in a very unnatural way. So we don't want the ragdoll to have that same joint limit for the sidestep. So if you set a 50% joint limit %, that's as far as his leg will go out. So one of the tricks you can do is, if you're doing a lot of ragdoll physics, is to set up your own joint limit %. So if we want to limit, at the moment sidestep is goes up to 115%. If you go and edit the settings and change the maximum limit to say 90, click OK, then you see his leg doesn't go up as high anymore. So you can create your own, and then you can save that figure. You can create your own ragdoll with exactly the joint, with more realistic joint limits through this settings here. It's the same with the twist. I mean, there's some, you can see that Ryan's got a massive amount of twist. Now we probably don't want that in the ragdoll, so you can adjust that specifically through the minimum maximum settings. So that covers joint limits. We'll now just have a quick look at some of the parameters that are associated with each ragdoll. If you select the ragdoll's body, then there are a bunch of other dials that are added to that ragdoll. So there's the joint limit %, which we've spoken about before. There's joint dampening, which is how much friction there is in the joint. So at the moment that's set to 0.01. If you want the ragdoll to be very stiff and immovable and not highly flexible, you can change that to 0.1 or 0.01, and that will give you that effect. There's the bone width, which I'll explain in a minute. There's ignore feet, and that's 0 or 1. So that is related to if a figure is walking, you don't, is keyframed until hit, you don't want the feet collisions to trigger the hit. So if you have a 1 there, it ignores the feet in the collision calculation. There's the ragdoll ERP and CFM, and that is when you are in the locked mode. It sets the particular joint hardness and constraint force matching. So again, in general, if you want a locked ragdoll, to have a bit of movement and a bit of give, then you would have a very low ERP, probably about 0.1, and about a very high CFM, say about 1 or 0.1. And again, you can check the web to get a more detailed understanding of what that means. There's Ragdoll test mode, and this is really neat. So we put a 1 in there to say it's in test mode, and when we run the simulation, you can see it actually builds a skeleton representing each bone in the ragdoll, and then that skeleton follows the ragdoll through the simulation. So if you're having trouble with a ragdoll doing something a bit odd, then you can actually see how the skeleton has been made up. Now if I set the body of Ryan to be invisible, then you can see these are the individual bones and how they're working, and that's really neat to be able to work out. Now one of the things you'll notice is that if we turn visibility on again, you'll see that Ryan's feet are flat, but the bone that it creates is on an angle, and that's because the in the setup room, Ryan's the bone for his foot is on an angle, and that means some of the foot simulations look a little odd, and the way to get around that is to change the joint limit percents of the foot. So at the moment the bend is, you can go from there all the way up to there, so -25. You might make the joint limit percent about -5 for feet to get better simulations. So that Ragdoll test mode is really handy. I'll turn that off. Oops. I'll turn that off. That's really handy for working out if you're having troubles getting the Ragdoll to simulate correctly. Now the bone width here is 1.3. That's actually the size of the boxes that the Ragdoll creates. So if you make this 1.8, you'll find the Ragdoll is much larger than the figure itself. And if you make it very small, you'll find that the bones are very skinny. So you shouldn't need to change that. The joint type and the anchor you can ignore. The friction, the bounce, and these other parameters you can ignore as well. They're set through the PoserPhysics GUI here. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea on some of the neat things you can do with Ragdolls, and if you have any questions, please feel very free to post them on Facebook or Twitter, or email me, or in one of the other forums, and I'll be happy to respond. Thanks for listening.